Hello. Today's presentation is A History of Extraordinary Circumstances, a survey of major geopolitical, financial, and health challenges that the Adventist Church has faced and overcome in its history. I hope you'll find the presentation today. It'll be a quick survey, but it will be reviewing some of the major events that we have faced as a church and how we have tackled them and how the Lord has led us through them to save souls despite the circumstances. We continue to live, as almost everyone surely is aware, in a world that is seemingly always emerging from, in, or on the edge of a new crisis. Such crises range from geopolitical tensions, wars and rumors of wars, conflicts, to financial troubles, to threats to our health from diseases or other natural disasters. And these events have, as most of us are aware, occurred fairly regularly throughout most of history. In the Bible, Jesus clearly forewarned us of these kinds of events, sharing in Matthew 24:6 that you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. These things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pains. However, the good news is that Jesus concludes in verse 14 that despite all this, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now we know that while Jesus' words apply to all of Christian history after he spoke them, they were true as the years and centuries went on. We know that they also have been true within the shorter history of just the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We all are also no stranger to the types of events just described by Jesus. Indeed, we might suggest the Adventist Church is perfectly built to weather the worldly storms many of us experience. Indeed, Seventh-day Adventism was officially born in the midst of one of America's bloodiest conflicts, the American Civil War, on May 21, 1863, in a place named none other than Battle Creek, Michigan. The place is named as apt, for the currents of war and turmoil would continue to flow around the church and its activities around the world for the next century and a half unto the present time. In today's presentation, I will share a brief survey just touching on some of the high points of the major political, financial, and health challenges that the Adventist Church has encountered and how they have been overcome by the grace of the God's Spirit. It would be appropriate to start our presentation today by mentioning the American Civil War. Of course, the Civil War was a horrendous conflict that tore and pit brother against brother and tore states apart and tore communities and towns apart. But we know that when it commenced, the soon-to-be Seventh-day Adventist movement only numbered some 3,500 members with about 125 congregations. What's interesting about the timing and location of these congregations is that they were exclusively located in the northern states. It may be that the providence of God saw fit to put the original location of the church and its rise as a movement, to have it planted in the border, not in the border states or in the south, where the churches and their members may have faced a much more hazardous experience in beginning of the Seventh-day Adventist message than they did. Even risk being, as we might say, wiped out. Buildings and other such could have been destroyed at great cost. But God's hand evidently was present, locating and preserving most of the new Adventist movement in the northern territories and states that would see more or less direct conflict. At the same time that we say that God helped preserve the origin of the Seventh-day Adventist movement at a time of tremendous conflict in our nation in the United States, we could say that there was never a better time for a moment of relevancy for a movement like the Seventh-day Adventist Church to appear, as the gospel message, when first announced by Christ himself, as recorded in Luke 4:18, explicitly stated that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Such an announcement of the true gospel message in its entire holistic scope would be very appropriate for the context of the Civil War in the United States when the church was birthed. Although the church, in hindsight and theologically, wisely, though not without controversy, adopted a position of non-combatancy as our official stance, they also made it clear that they were strongly in sympathy with the anti-slavery cause and supported the Union, with numerous articles shared to that effect in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald and several of our other periodicals of the time. This first trial of our relevancy as a church was a tremendous success for the church, and our growth continued steadily following the Civil War. In the years after the Civil War, we know as the era of Reconstructionism and the rise of new kinds of racism in the South and various other class warfare conflicts, we know that the United States would remain in many respects a country torn asunder. It was not easy to heal from the wounds that the war had wrought. Although efforts were made to integrate the two halves of our nation, the North and South, after some time, some of the old cultural elements resurfaced and rampant racism existed throughout the South and in some parts of the North. As this dynamic developed in the late 1890s, the Adventist Church was not inactive. Although often slow and lacking a fully energized response, as we might add that it was with many of the matters that it was facing at the time, at the urging of Ellen White and with her own son Edson involved, work among the former slaves commenced, and as the decades went on, progress was surely seen. Not only in America would this kind of activity take place, similar problems such as class warfare and other types of tensions, social tensions, existed in other nations at this time. For example, during this same general period, a mission service took place by individuals such as Ferdinand Stahl, a German-American who traveled with his wife Anna to South America, spending a lot of his life transforming the people in the highlands of Peru and along the Amazon, educating the illiterate through schools and teaching them how to transform their society and gain liberty for themselves. Their efforts won many into the church and even helped with altering the nation's constitution to officially recognize religious liberty. These older examples vividly but briefly illustrate the pioneer spirit to engage in God's work wherever it may be found and under whatever circumstances may exist. Of course, not always did things go smoothly, but God was still leading our movement when you step back and see where we were trying to go. Now, as the 1890s moved along, as time began to move forward, it is apropos to note that at different times in the past, we as a Seventh-day Adventist Church have faced one of the greatest challenges that we have anticipated, expected, predicted, and that would be the rise of religious fervor, including in particular Sunday laws that would restrict religious liberty throughout the United States. There was a group of many fervent Christians in the 1890s that were trying to do this. They were trying to create Sunday laws to preserve Christianity for their country, something of which, of course, Adventists have been keenly attuned to since our inception in the 1860s. However, we did not stand idly by when this occurred. Alongside Ellen White's own comments in support of our activism for liberty, the influence of other church leaders such as Alonzo T. Jones mobilized Adventists to come to the forefront of political action advocating for religious liberty, which played a major role in shaping the history of Adventist public ministry. Alonzo Jones' editorship of the American Sentinel, the first Adventist magazine dedicated to the advocacy of religious liberty, left an enduring legacy of Adventist public involvement through the use of media. Around the same time in the late 1890s, America faced another financial crisis, known more widely as a currency crisis between silver and gold. Ellen White, in this instance, happened to offer a sharp rebuke to some Adventists and other Christians who overly engaged themselves in what she considered a speculative venture to use disputed worldly means to advance economic goals, specifically via the elimination of the gold standard, as encouraged by other Christian fundamentalists such as William Jennings Bryan. Her stance encouraged a more realistic and conservative approach to economics followed by most Adventists over the following century. As the century turned the corner and we entered into the 1900s or the 20th century, other natural disasters and events took place that also shook the church and the United States. One of them would be the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and the ensuing fire. Of course, Adventism has been no stranger to natural disasters, but this was one of our first ones that we went through together as a church. Although Ellen White made clear that she herself did not predict the precise incident of April 18, 1906, sharing since the San Francisco earthquake, many rumors have been made regarding current statements I have made. Some have reported that while in Los Angeles, I claimed that I had predicted the San Francisco earthquake and fire and that Los Angeles would be the next city to suffer. This is not true. The morning after the earthquake, I said no more than that earthquakes will come and floods will come, and that the Lord's message to us is that we should not establish or root ourselves in the wicked cities. It is clear that her views merely echoed that of Jesus' words in Matthew 24. She foresaw in visions that natural disasters, as well as perhaps human-caused ones like the San Francisco fires that helped follow the earthquake, would befall many wicked places or cities where wickedness was common. And the history of Adventism up to the present affirms this reality. Concerning specifically the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the Church was not slow to respond, issuing a special edition of the Signs of the Times entitled Earthquake Special. The purpose of the special edition was not only to raise money for the damaged Pacific press, which had been hurt by the earthquake, but to acquaint the world with the meaning of the earthquake, for the world should be made acquainted with the most rapid, simple means with the meaning of these things. Thousands of copies were distributed with Ellen White's enthusiastic support that such a commendable effort is being made to give this earthquake special a large circulation. Perhaps one of the most significant geopolitical issues that early Adventism faced would be what we might call today Americentrism in contrast to global missions. Although John N. Andrews was sent to Switzerland in 1874, foreign missions remained quite limited until after 1901, and also mostly to just Europe. This geopolitical situation was not actually what God intended or desired. Rather, writing from her time in Australia in 1892, Ellen White wrote, "The missionary work in Australia and New Zealand is yet in its infancy. But the same work must be accomplished in Australia, New Zealand, Africa, India, China, and the islands of the sea, as has been accomplished in the home field," referring to the United States. Under the appropriate symbol of an angel flying through the midst of heaven is represented the work of the people of God. In this work, heavenly intelligences cooperate with human agencies in extending the last messages to the inhabitants of the world. Ellen White's admonition was finally put into effect near the end of her life and the following decades under the GC Secretariat and the leadership in particular of William Spicer and Arthur G. Daniels, both of whom would serve as president as well. Men of vision who correctly saw the entire world as the vineyard for our missionaries. The tremendous growth in the worldwide body of Seventh-day Adventism can be attributed to the diligent and sacrificial work of thousands of Adventist missionaries during this first half of the 20th century. As time would progress, again, the world would be no stranger to other major conflicts, not just the Civil War in the United States, but the world would have two major conflicts in the first half of the 20th century. That would have a significant impact on the Church's work in all of the countries directly impacted by these wars, and as world wars, that was a significant number of the populated countries. Yet while our work may have not progressed in such areas in any significant way during the actual years of conflict, that is not to say that the Church was inactive elsewhere. Indeed, our global mission planning was very aggressive during the wars, and the fruit of this labor was seen afterward of each one. We were planning aggressively to where we could send our missionaries and how we could train them, and we did a great work during the wars, even when we could not actually send missionaries. At the same time, the world wars also saw the rise in prominence of our official status as conscientious objectors, which would highlight our mission of peace and the value we place on life. Although various hardships, including prison time, were sometimes faced by Adventists in some countries where this stance was not accepted, the wars also brought to light the bravery and sacrificial spirit of many of our soldiers. Notable stories have often been repeated, such as that of Desmond Doss in World War II, whose refusal to bear arms brought him unwanted attention by his officers in the U.S. military, but later the Medal of Honor for his heroics as a medic. And these stories are noteworthy. Other names could be mentioned, such as the medic Keith R. Graves, who was a paratrooper in World War II in North Africa and also became a prisoner of war. Their stories of heroism amidst the trying circumstances of their times inspired those around them, and their stories live on today. In the early half of the 20th century, there was another pandemic of a flu virus, Of course, today it's impossible to not be aware of the fact that we're emerging from the end of another pandemic, of a flu, but the 1918 flu was unique in that in the way it impacted, or rather I should say the 2020 flu is unique in the way that it has impacted global society, especially alongside the rise of technology that allows us to continue communicating while distant. But flu pandemics are hardly new to human history, and Adventism has seen them before, most notably in 1918 through 19, a year in which between 50 to 100 million people died from the disease, far more than have actually died in our current crisis. At the time, church leaders such as F.M. Wilcox embraced both common sense and medical counsel to avoid undue spread of the disease, sharing that it was high time that Adventists become intelligent in the employment of the rational remedies and system of treatment, which is a denomination we have a knowledge of for many years. Others likewise urged the present disease situation is recognized as a serious one, and all persons are urged by the highest medical authorities to give careful heed to every precautionary measure. Don't be frightened. Simply take good care of yourself and help to safeguard others. While Adventists were hardly immune to its effects, our beliefs about healthful living did provide a testimony of their value, saving many lives. Again, in the first half of the 20th century, we faced one of the most significant financial crises that the world has ever faced, and that was the Great Depression, which lasted for nearly a decade. Starting in 1929, it devastated most of the globe's developed economies, which wouldn't recover for several years, not fully until after World War II. While it had a major impact on the Seventh-day Adventist Church's ability to conduct its programs and operations, God's spirit of generosity was still with its members, and the work did continue. We can look back at the records and note that in 1912, the average per member tithe income was $14.48. Mission offerings that year were an average of $4.47 per member. In 1932, however, during the Great Depression, while the average tithe had decreased to $13.08, mission offerings actually increased with an average of $5.83 per member. Noting or pointing out that the emphasis that we had on foreign missions and reaching the globe remained very strong even when we ourselves were struggling. This powerful witness to their trust in God and His work was rewarded soon afterward as the global membership did skyrocket in the decades following the Great Depression. God's faithfulness held true in every economic crisis, including this past one connected with COVID-19. While we cannot discount the genuine struggles that many have endured, including within the church, God has still found a way to keep His church engaged in its mission around the world. Other later challenges and problems of various political and economic natures would face the church in the latter half of the 20th century, including communism, which would be one of the darker episodes in recent history, world history, under the Soviet regime. Its influence over the lives of millions of people, many of whom lost their lives for several decades, will not soon be forgotten. Nevertheless, despite the fact that the Adventist Church faced many challenges of different sorts under different areas or different countries within the communist field, stories of hope emerged, and against all odds, the church laid the groundwork for impressive growth, sometimes under direct persecution, sometimes amidst the sea of religious apathy. Nevertheless, in several countries dominated by communism, the Adventist Church found a way to thrive. In an irony worthy of more study, the release of persecution has sometimes led to more subtle problems. As we move into more recent times, the situation has not changed, and some of the problems that we have visited in previous eras of history sometimes, unfortunately, continue, endure, and resurface. When we look to parts of Africa, for example, like South Africa, we can look at the terrible, tragic legacy of apartheid and racism that has plagued that part of the world. The system of segregation in South Africa and other places created numerous challenges for the Adventist Church, many of which, in all honesty, were not always handled in the best ways, sometimes not in a good way at all, notwithstanding our ideals that we did try and promote. Despite sometimes errors done at the local and regional levels, alongside questionable policy decisions, the gospel nevertheless continued to be advanced, setting the groundwork for a strong and thriving church today. So while the scars of apartheid and other social ills in other parts of the world continue to be addressed and we attempted to heal them, by the grace of God, the church itself has seen and found a way to grow. In conclusion for today's talk, we can again remind everyone that Adventism is a church built for surviving worldly crises. Odd as that may sound, what we mean here, of course, is that God's message is one that is meant to reach people in their crises, to remind them that His love endures for all and is intended to reach the lowly and the oppressed and those who are suffering. At the same time, those who have already received the gospel message are under a special burden to reach out to those suffering under wars, pestilence, and financial upheavals. The history of the Adventist Church shows that it has been resilient amidst worldly calamities. While they may take their toll in the moment, the church has come through afterward all the stronger by God's grace. Severe trial endured by the grace of God develops patience, vigilance, fortitude, and a deep and abiding trust in God. It is the triumph of the Christian faith that it enables its followers to suffer and be strong, to submit and thus be conquerors, to be killed all day long and yet to live, to bear the cross and thus to win the crown of glory.